Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Hudson Institute. My name is Joel Scanlon, Executive Vice President here at Hudson, and it is my great pleasure to welcome back the Right Honorable Dame Priti Patel, Member of Parliament for Whittam, Shadow Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Affairs. First elected to Parliament in 2010, Dame Patel has held key positions in the government, including Secretary of State for Home Affairs, Secretary of State for International Development, Minister of State for Employment, Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, as well as being appointed the first ever UK-India Diaspora Champion in 2013. In these roles, she has worked to address key challenges facing the transatlantic community, from terrorism to organized crime, large-scale migration, Russia's war against Ukraine, and hybrid threats presented by authoritarian state actors. The Anglo-American alliance has long been the cornerstone of transatlantic security, including during the decades of the Cold War. In the earliest stages of that long twilight struggle, Winston Churchill delivered one of his most important speeches in Fulton, Missouri. We rightly remember his remarks for his prescient assessment of Soviet-Russian aggression and the Iron Curtain casting a shadow across newly liberated Europe. It is worth noting, in the current political moment, that Churchill himself entitled the speech, "The Sinews of Peace," a peace built upon a clear-eyed vision of Anglo-American strength and kinship and deterrence in the face of tyranny. Next week will mark the 80th anniversary of Churchill's calling for a post-war order built on the special relationship. It is fitting that we hear once again the importance of the UK-US alliance in light of the authoritarian challenges of the 21st century. Would you please join me in welcoming Dame Priti Patel.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen and friends. And look, it's a great privilege and an honor to be here to mark, as we've just heard, the 80th anniversary of what was an era-defining Iron Curtain speech by Sir Winston Churchill. And if there was any one man who symbolizes that bridge between the United Kingdom and the United States, the special relationship, it was Sir Winston Churchill. From his Anglo-American parentage to his belief in the combined strength and the shared values of the English-speaking peoples. No one person has done more to bring about unity of purpose of the United Kingdom and the United States in defending our values and our freedoms. And while that great and memorable speech was delivered 80 years ago, it resonates today because its themes and messages matter as we face new threats and new challenges to our freedoms. So I'm delighted to be here at Hudson today to very much reflect upon how our two great democracies must once more come together with that unity of purpose to fight for freedom, just as we did in the years before and the decades that followed the Iron Curtain speech. And I'd very much like to thank our hosts here at Hudson's and also many of our friends in Washington who are at the forefront of our fight for our values and our beliefs and have given lasting peace to freedom and prosperity. Freedom, as the great Ronald Reagan famously said, is never more than a generation away from extinction. It has to be fought for and defended by each generation. And today, that responsibility falls to us all, as we are the generation that stands between freedom, surviving, or falling. With Western values of democracy and the rule of law under assault from multiple directions, we have to reaffirm our enduring values and interests that unite us and be forthright about what is dragging us down. Only then will the torch of freedom be forever bright and carried to the darkest corners of the world, giving new generations hope, peace, and prosperity. So I want to take this opportunity to share with you my thoughts and reflections on the threats that freedom faces as the malign forces, in particular, who undermine us every single day, and importantly, what our great two democracies can do to act as champions of our values and freedoms and keep that torch of freedom shining bright. Of course, there's much to debate on how we've got to where we are today and the new hostilities that we collectively face. In March 1946, as well as commenting on the Iron Curtain dividing our world, Winston Churchill made the case of Western democracies to stand together. And he warned that if they become divided or falter in their duty And if those all-important years are allowed to slip away, then indeed catastrophe may overwhelm us. So we took heed of those warnings on both sides of the Atlantic. NATO was formed. We invested in arms, technologies, and new capabilities. Through strong and assertive leadership, we led a positive vision to enable citizens, our citizens, to have a future based upon prosperity choice. We gave them the freedom to succeed, reach their own potential, without the fear or intimidation of the state. Free enterprise and open markets grew, and our horizons expanded. With new opportunities, our economies grew stronger, and importantly, they generated the wealth and prosperity needed to build strong countries and fund our security and defense. To this day, though, we still bear the scars of the Cold War. Brave men and women were lost in conflicts, Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts elsewhere. The war memorials in this great city stand as a tribute to their courage and to their sacrifice. Over generations, British and American warriors have shed their blood in defense of liberty and freedom. That enabled the West to stand firm for 5 following decades, and communism and its state-sponsored tyranny, it seemed at the time, was defeated. Some of those nations that were stuck behind the Iron Curtain were liberated as the Berlin Wall fell, thanks to immense leadership provided by Thatcher and Reagan. And today, those countries have been transformed from puppet states of the Soviet Union to strong and vibrant democracies. Some of them now are our closest friends and prosperous allies. But while the geopolitical landscape changed and the map of the free grew, and some in the East were genuine in their commitment at embracing democracy and Western values, there remained a dangerous and determined cabal committed not necessarily to the ideology of communism, but to the methods of control and the tools of authoritarianism. They plotted and developed their long-term plans. George Kennan in 1946, as the acting ambassador in the US Embassy in Moscow, wrote, "Everything possible will be done to set major Western powers against each other. Anti-British talk will be plugged amongst Americans, anti-American talk amongst British continentals. Where suspicion exists, they'll be found. Where not ignited, no effort will be spared to discredit and combat all efforts which threaten to lead to any sort of unity or cohesion." Which brings us really to where we find ourselves today. Russia and their allies are countries which have grown in their power and influence. They have redefined warfare and tyranny. Just over 2 decades ago, that danger emerged when soon after coming to power, Putin sought to interfere in Ukraine's presidential elections, with the Orange Revolution bravely resisting. This was followed in 2008 with the Russo-Georgian War. And as the West continued to be focused on operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then failed to stand up to Assad in Syria and dithered over whether or not to act or intervene, Putin struck again, taking Crimea in 2014. And now, as we mark the 4 years since his full-scale illegal invasion of Ukraine, we see the full evidence of that. But what marks today's axis of authoritarian states so potent is, of course, its geographical reach. And by that, I'm referring to China. With China's assertiveness and its economic dependency it has created, and its 30-year program of military expansion, which has seen defense spending increasing from $25 billion in 1994 to approximately $318 billion in 2024. That's a 13-fold increase. While Western military spending has, of course, fluctuated, China has been relentless. And it's not just in their military hard power that threatens us. They've created an extensive network of spies across our key businesses and our democratic institutions for one purpose: to destabilize us and threaten us. From their barbaric acts of transnational repression against Hong Kongers in Britain to cyber attacks against our democratic institutions, China is using economic exploitation and coercion to undermine our international norms, our rules-based system, while assaulting our values, freedom, and sovereign interests. And of course, alongside Russia and China, in that axis of authoritarianism, are North Korea, who continue to pose a threat to all of us. And then, of course, there is Iran. Iran is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, a brutal and barbaric regime, a regime so murderous that it has slaughtered a generation of freedom fighters, tens of thousands of its own citizens. Iran commits barbarities against foreign civilians through their terrorist surrogates, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. They threaten all our interests, at home and abroad. And while they brutally suppress the freedoms of their own country, silence their critics, destroy the rights of their citizens, and continue to pursue nuclear weapons to threaten our existence to our friends and to our allies, they threaten my country too. The Iranian people and the world must see this tyranny consigned to where it belongs, the ash heap of history. So confronting this axis of authoritarianism is the geopolitical challenge of our time. They are united in seeking to destroy the international order built by us and built by our allies. They supply each other with weapons like the Iranian Shahid drones Putin uses to murder Ukrainians. They support the proliferation of nuclear weapons and conspire to develop nuclear arsenals to threaten us. They are committed to undermining our democracies and weakening the resolve of the West. They have no regard or care for individual rights, values, dignity, or freedoms. And sadly, within our own countries, we see those at home assaulting our Western values, our rule of law, and all that unites us by standing up for some of those that threaten our own nations. I see it, we see it in London, when Iran backs and funds the hate marches that intimidate and threaten our Jewish communities with anti-Semitic chants. So as custodians for freedom and Western values, surrender and subjugation to tyranny is no option for us. Our focus has to be on the means available to us to achieve our national objectives, making the case for what is right for peace and security at home and abroad and across the world. Our greatest leaders knew exactly what it took to be strong in the face of threats to our very way of life and to our democracy. Military might, institutional reform, and winning the battle of ideas. So military might does exactly what it says on the tin. We must match the military force of our adversaries with superior deterrence and defence. Modern deterrence is no longer defined by the nuclear component and advanced platforms alone. It's based upon replenishment speed, ammunition depth, innovation, technology, and resilient supply chains. Political leadership requires the prioritisation of production speed, surge readiness, with suppliers enabled to scale up and attract private capital to support long-term deterrence and demand. Putin's war in Ukraine reinforced a core and brutal lesson to us all, that our sovereignty depends upon strong economies, political stability, secure access to energy and critical minerals to bolster our defence capabilities. Without these resilient supply chains, our nations face strategic vulnerabilities. And of course, here in America, our friends have a renewed focus to invest in domestic production, building minilateral strategic partnerships with allies and friends in recognition that long-term resilience and competitiveness must never, ever be under threat again. We defeated the Soviet Union in the Cold War, in part because they could not match the investments of our defence and deterrence. And we, my friends, must do that again. We must also ensure that the transatlantic defence and security alliance, both through NATO and our own bilateral relations with the US, become rock solid. I have to say that the President deserves great credit for pressing Europe into increasing its defence spending on national security by 2035. But of course, we need to be absolutely clear now on what that money will be spent on. There should be no ambiguity whatsoever on what constitutes national security spending. And I say this because in my country, back home, we have a Labour government, and Labour is trying to blend its net zero energy spending into that figure to boost the numbers. Our defence spending, in my view, is pretty clear. It must translate into defence capabilities, not some kind of long-term aspiration to promote net zero zealotry to appease left-wing sceptics. Hard cash and weaponry is what deters those who seek to threaten us. We also must use our diplomatic might to stand up to our adversaries. Many of you may have seen in the UK, and probably rightly questioned this as well, that the Labour government made this extraordinary decision to grant the Chinese Communist Party planning permission for a super embassy spy hub in the heart of London. So let me tell you about this spy hub. The site is next door to the strategic fibre cables which carry data to Britain's financial institutions, including the London Stock Exchange. From this location, CCP spies will expand their operations, undermining us all, pursuing more acts of transnational repression and spying. And by the way, this decision came days before Jimmy Lai, a British citizen, was sentenced to 20 years for defending and speaking up for democracy and freedoms of Hong Kongers, all the freedoms that they should enjoy. It is a great source of shame for Britain that my government, our government, chose to kowtow to China rather than stand firm, just so that Keir Starmer could travel to China as Beijing's useful idiot in London and be photographed with President Xi while bringing nothing back home for Britain. But this is just one of many examples of unforgivable weakness. When America and Israel took action last year to degrade Iran's nuclear weapons program, the UK Prime Minister dithered and did nothing to support our allies. To our great shame, he couldn't even give a view on whether he thought the actions were lawful. Where Britain's weak Labour government capitulates, I can assure you that in the UK, the Conservative Party in Britain will stand firm to defend our country and our allies from these fundamental threats. Our adversaries must know that they can never match our capabilities and that we will stand up to their threats and intimidation. And the British people and our citizens must know that we will always put their national security first. On institutional reform, it is time to face the facts that the rules-based international order is not working. Our enemies not only ignore it, they weaponize it and use it against us. Many of you all may know that Britain has been on the receiving end of international lawfare, orchestrated by politically motivated left-wing lawyers, judges and their activist friends. We've seen international committees and bodies that few have heard of, but we all pay for them, which challenge and question our sovereignty over the British Indian Ocean Territory, the Chagos Islands, which is home to the strategic important US military base on Diego Garcia. China, Russia and Iran all celebrated and worked to achieve this damning outcome. But rather than stand up for our interests and freedoms, the Labour government has backed down to surrender a British sovereign territory to a foreign government. Now, if it were not for the intervention of the President of the United States and the forensic deconstruction of this terrible Labour policy by my party in Parliament, this sovereign territory would already be in the hands of the government of Mauritius. Together, the UK and America, that's my party, and the American administration have worked to delay the ratification of this terrible legislation. And I want to thank the White House team for listening to the calls of their British Conservative allies to stop this appalling surrender. And some of you may have heard the news this morning, just before I came in to give this address, that the UK government, a government minister, has now said that they're now pausing this legislation. America has stood with us on our shared determination not to let left-wing, politically motivated acts of lawfare undermine our shared defence and security. My party will continue to fight to stop Labour's 35 billion Chagos surrender. And let me say something about why this fight to keep Chagos British matters. The UK special relationship is built on our shared history and our values. It extends beyond the personalities of who holds political office at any one time. And it is a source of comfort and security to know that our friendship has stood the test of time. Together we have fought side by side in some of the greatest battles in the last century. And as a result, our military, defence and security partnership is the closest of any two countries. But Labour's Chagos surrender and their approach to the use of Diego Garcia threatens the future of our special relationship by undermining that century of cooperation, goodwill, trust and friendship. We cannot afford to put our defence and security at risk with this surrender of sovereignty, because once we do, There is no turning back. And once Labour weakens UK control over Chagos and Diego Garcia, they weaken our special relationship. Conservatives will not put that at risk, and it's another reason why we are fighting so strongly against it. Labour's Chagos surrender is a timely reminder of why we must reform the international institutions being abused and manipulated against our interests. Take, for instance, the so-called UN Special Rapporteurs, regularly breaching principles of neutrality and impartiality, whether it's in their comments about Israel or their interventions to support criminals and terrorists going through the UK courts. Those acting on behalf of the UN are not adhering to the standards that we expect. And then, of course, there's UNRWA, infiltrated by Hamas terrorists. And when the UN is challenged over this, rather than reviewing or reflecting, they seek to attack and smear. Now, I can speak about this because during my time as International Development Secretary, I pressed for reforms on how aid money was spent and accounted for, on the practices of the UN agencies, and I challenged unethical practices, including the sexual exploitation of vulnerable women and children in crisis around the world that took place by so-called aid workers. These institutions have failed to stand up to scrutiny. They failed to work on behalf of those that they were meant to protect. It was not the United Nations and its endless resolutions and rapporteur reports that brought the hostages back from Gaza and established the 20-point plan. It was US diplomacy, working with partners in the region and the direct leadership of President Trump. It was not the United Nations that brought Iran to the negotiating table over its nuclear program. It was the US and the might of Israel. So for the UN and other global institutions to be relevant in the 21st century, they must be reformed. No more blank checks, and we will use our influence and our financial clout, our seat at the table, with our allies to press them to act in accordance with the values and principles they were originally established for. And the more they mobilize their political supporters to criticize us for calling them, we will call for greater accountability and we will press for change. The final word in our fight for freedom is on the battle of ideas. As Conservatives, we believe in the power of the markets, enterprise and democracy, in free speech, liberty, meritocracy. But our values and beliefs are being undermined by cancel culture and the woke disease that has spread across our institutions. People are being taught to hate our countries, our values and our past, and being taught to promote and support ideas that do not serve our interests and weaken our economies and our standing in the world. For while they seek to cancel us, because they know in the fair fight their arguments would not stand the test of time, we must never step back from arguing our case, defeating them at the ballot box and winning the hearts and minds of the public. Making the case for the benefits of freedom, what it means, what it delivers to improve the lives of families and generations, our communities, is exactly why we must keep on fighting to defend our values. So to conclude, our mission today is one that pitches us in a battle for freedom and for the very survival of our Western values and beliefs. Since the end of the Cold War, our enemies have taken advantage of how we chose to use the Cold War dividend. But as custodians of the special relationship, it falls to us once more to win the great battle of freedom as the future of peace, prosperity in the world once again rests with us. Thank you all, and God bless our two great nations.
Well, thank you so much for being here at Hudson and for that very uplifting speech. I think that oftentimes when we look at the tremendous challenges we have from authoritarian states, both internal challenges in our country and external, it can be overwhelming. But I think that you laid out very adeptly what we can do together, I think, to confront those challenges. So perhaps if we could start with the issue of the day. The pause on the bill to hand over the Chagos archipelago to Mauritius. This is quite a win. You've been an outspoken opponent, and Hudson, of course, has written as well on this issue. You've met with a number of leaders in Capitol Hill. Could you distill for us today sort of what are the 2 or 3 main points that you make when you're speaking on this issue to them? And also, time is ticking now on the session of Parliament. Do you think that this bill is gone for good?
Well, let me just start off with the main points to make really about this. Britain is a great nation, and the minute you start compromising sovereignty, I say this as someone that fought for Brexit as well, sovereignty and independence, you're on a slippery slope downwards. And it is still incomprehensible. I still find it just mind-boggling how a Labour government thought that it was acceptable to give away an overseas territory, and by the way, spend 35 billion of British taxpayers' money in this process and not think that the British public would react, and obviously us as Conservatives would react and respond. So it's a principle, basically, of this whole issue of giving away a sovereign territory. But then, of course, it's not any sovereign territory. It's home to Diego Garcia. And as you've heard me say already, our military and security can never be compromised between our 2 countries. And that is the golden thread in terms of this special relationship. We've always been in lockstep. We've always been rock solid in our military and security cooperation with our closest ally, the United States. And, it seems that we've had a government just sort of like meandering into this, acting in such a stupid way, to quote the president, and without thinking of the consequences. And then you've asked about the process. This process has been going on in Parliament. For those that don't follow our great House of Commons, this started last year, in the spring of last year. The actual bill that the Labour government presented to Parliament is a very short bill. However, we have tied them up in knots through something like 160 parliamentary questions, opposition day debates, and, you can name it. But they have failed themselves to justify the case. So the government have announced this morning that they're going to pause the passage of the bill through Parliament. You've asked about the legislative timetable. Quite frankly, this bill should never see the light of day again, and it should fall from this complete, not just this parliamentary schedule, but the bill should be scrapped completely.
Thank you. It does seem like the process on both sides of the Atlantic, it was a bit of a zombie bill. You had the State Department sort of saying one thing, and then the president would turn his attention, I think, had a very different view, as they made clear. So I think, again, here also points to the importance of U.S. attention in the special relationship, U.S. leadership on this. And you talk in your remarks about our generation being the stewards of the special relationship. And so you think about the importance of Diego Garcia in 99 years and even beyond that, it'll continue to be important. So perhaps if we could now turn to the other big issue of the day, and that's Iran. The U.S. has built up quite a fleet in the surrounding region. The president has given a 10 to 15-day timeline for an agreement. Do you think an agreement is possible, and how do you see the Russians, the Chinese reacting to Western U.S.-led efforts to topple the regime?
So I think first and foremost, I think we should just remember what has happened in Iran this year alone. At the beginning of January, we saw the most appalling extremes of brutality against, I don't say this lightly, but a generation of freedom fighters. They were Iran's young population that had been murdered and brutalized by this awful barbaric regime. We can't stand by and just ignore all of that at all. And, they were cries for help from the Iranian citizens. And it is, something now that we've seen the US fleet, the American Armada, as it's now being referred to, really across the Gulf. It is putting pressure on Iran, and rightly so, to come round to the negotiating table, and quite right too. And of course, the key pillars of this negotiation will be about nuclear enrichment and the ballistic missiles. And fundamentally, what is going to happen in those talks, we can't speculate, we simply don't know. And we know that the talks will take place, hopefully, in Geneva later on this week. The regime cannot ever have a nuclear weapon. The regime completely has to desist in terms of its threats, the way in which it's sponsoring proxies. So you've heard what I've had to say about, even in the UK, what we see. Quite frankly, I actually think that all our governments have to be really robust. And it's demonstrating that deterrence posture that I spoke about, but it's also going after these Iranian proxies. So Hamas we know about, obviously, in Gaza. Hezbollah, clearly there is, the Israelis are doing a lot there already. Then you have the Houthis. But even in London, I don't think the British government are doing enough. And, I press them on this too. There is still a discussion about prescription of the IRGC. We've offered to support emergency legislation in the House of Commons to work with the government on doing this, and yet they're still hiding behind the sofa or even under the table right now. This is just feebleness and weakness, and it doesn't show that we're in a position of strength at all. And it's no wonder, therefore, that the president made the comments that he did, coming back to Diego Garcia in Iran last week, that he did. His, the frustration that we're our big allies when we have this major nuclear threat from Iran that targets all of us. So we have to be robust, we really do.
The UK has stepped up, I think, within NATO in particular, or has always had a leadership role there. But the US, I think, is a little less interested in certain components and stepping back from that. So the UK has taken over command of JFC Norfolk. Yeah. Also has helped co-chair the Ukraine Defense Contact Group. So for you, what should Britain's role be within NATO, where the US is still an active member, but perhaps taking a bit of a reduced role in certain areas?
So, I mean, we've always been strong in NATO. There's no question about that. And, I was recently at the Munich Security Conference and met some of our own NATO colleagues there as well, and representatives from Britain. There is a lot of good work that's taking place, but it's not business as usual. We should be clear about that. So it's a case of how do we prepare in terms of military planning, preparedness, exercises. We've been have over recent years been working with the Estonians and the JEF countries, for example, with military operations and training soldiers. We need to do a hell of a lot more of that ourselves, by the way, we really do. And for the UK to be strong in NATO, there is something that my government needs to be doing as well, and that's also increasing its defence spending and really stepping up. And as I've said, not just putting in the wind turbines into the balance sheet or the spreadsheet and the dodgy accounting that the Labour government likes to do, as they've done on the Chagos Islands as well. This is a serious moment. This is absolutely a serious moment, I think, for NATO, but actually to demonstrate once again that when it comes to deterrence and defence, we are the masters of it. We are the leaders, and it does take strong leadership to do that. It does take, a strong prime minister, strong political parties to be making the case, and that's what my party is doing. We will continue to do that, and it's just worth me just pointing out finally on this point. It was my party that persuaded the Labour government last year to use overseas development aid assistance, our ODA budget, to use parts of that to increase our defence spending contributions. So, we're trying to be part of the solution here as well, where Labour can't lead and govern and find ideas and solutions. We're here to do a lot of that too.
Thank you. I think about here, of course, in the 80th anniversary of Churchill's speech in Missouri, and part of the reason I think that speech is remembered in history is that at the time it was a bit of an unwelcome message, right? In 1946, people were taking on sort of the peace dividend, and I think that you're ringing a lot of the same alarm bells now about the threat from authoritarianism, including internally, the way that these nations are active in trying to undermine our own democracies. And so you've talked quite a bit about defense spending. Last month, we heard that in the MOD said that they'll require an extra 28 billion pounds over the next 4 years to meet forecast costs. How do you place defense spending in terms of budget priorities for you? And do you think that the public is receptive to the idea that there are going to have to potentially be sacrifices in other places of the budget in order to increase defense spending?
So on your latter point, that's our job, to make them aware of this and to make them realize, when they switch on the news and they see what's going on in the Middle East and the American Armada in situ and the capabilities and the threats that exist out there, we have a duty as today's politicians and leaders to make that case. This is not a threat that's just thousands upon thousands of miles away from us. And we know that when you think about the range of ballistic missiles, for example. And also, that's on the military power fire side. But then look at what happens with hybrid warfares and capabilities too. Spies, espionage, cyber threats. These things are happening every single day to all our countries. China leads that, Iran leads that in my country. So we have to demonstrate and keep on making the case and say to the public, this is literally on your mobile phones, on your computers. If you're a small business, I have small businesses, a lot of them in my constituency in Essex. Those small businesses could have their supply chains destroyed or disturbed or distorted alongside many of their financial communication systems. This is real life stuff, it really is. So we have a duty to make the case. And then in terms of how we get there, the budgetary priorities have to be our national security. Our security is under threat, and it's been ages. I mean, there's been a long time. I have to say it's probably the Thatcher-Reagan era that made that case so passionately, so robustly, because we felt it a lot more back then. It was that fight for freedom. Now, I am a child of the 80s, and I remember a lot of that. But just because we've had the 90s and, things have felt good, and prosperity has trickled down, doesn't mean we can take that for granted. This is a really serious moment for the West and for all of us. And my final point on this, through many of the discussions that I have with our allies, NATO allies in particular, a lot of European colleagues who are part of NATO, even those that are in that fight against Russia and, for Ukraine right now, we've learned so much in recent years. We have to build upon that, we really do. We can't step back at all. And again, just on the point about Ukraine, when you look at their capabilities in drone technology and the way in which they're now world-class and first-in-class, that is a reminder of how we all need to really up our game and put, money literally where our mouth is. It's hard cash, and that's the only way we're going to protect our countries, our communities, and effectively our way of life.
I'm glad that you brought up Ukraine. Yesterday was marked the 4th anniversary of the second invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and I think that there's a sense of, obviously not optimism, but I think stoic resolve. I think on the Ukrainians, that you still feel that their defense innovation, in particular, their ability that they've withstood Russia's attacks against their energy infrastructure this winter, that I think that they can see potentially some progress on the ground, that there maybe is a bit of optimism, I think, about the future course of the war. How do you see the UK's role in sustaining Ukraine's fight against Russia, potentially for the next number of years, if peace negotiations don't come to a resolution? And how would you like to see, what are some specific things that you'd like to see the Western governments do to hold the Russians to account for the barbarism in Ukraine?
So on Russia, it's quite clear that there is more to do. We all use the language every week in Parliament. We're talking about sanctions, more sanctions, this, that, and the other. Yeah. Russia spends its time also busting sanctions and circumventing sanctions. The story of the famous white labelling of Russian oil is taking place constantly. There are, key refineries in Turkey, in China, and India that still haven't been tackled or sanctioned or shut down, and they're white labelling this oil and reselling it on the marketplace. This is exactly where we should be working together. It's the conversation that I've had here this week while I've been on the Hill and with colleagues and friends and allies here. We need to do it. We just need to do it. The British government doesn't have any answers on this, despite us really pursuing this. And, for me, it's a straightforward act that we should do. And by the way, our Prime Minister has been to 2 of those 3 countries recently, China and Turkey, and didn't even raise this. So that is an act of weakness. It really is. And then on the fight of the incredible people of Ukraine. I mean, their resilience is just extraordinary. They will go down forever as heroes in history, but they need help. They need actual help. I know it's been cold in Washington, but winter in Ukraine has been absolutely brutal. And, the basic things that they need, the generators, how do they plug the energy deficiency gaps that they need? Those are practical things that we can do. Then, of course, there's hard cash. And one of the key things that I heard, even in Munich, through all the discussions with the Ukrainians, and I met the Ukrainian ambassador to Washington yesterday as well, it's literally stick with us, be with us every step of the way. But it is resources that they need.
Do you foresee the UK playing a role with sort of boots on the ground for any kind of potential reassurance force or, a force to sort of monitor a ceasefire? Do you think that would be something that would be a good role for the UK? And sort of how do you see that in terms of negotiations?
Well, I think, first of all, we're not there. Let's just be clear about that. I don't even think Russia's serious about negotiating whatsoever. There's no indication of that. Putin just sticks with his old KGB playbook and just sort of plays everybody. So that's the reality of where we are today. Now, of course, my country has great capabilities. Our people, our armed service personnel, our men and women, they do serve and they are deployed around the world and have been, peacekeeping, other crises, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, we have capabilities, but we're simply not there yet. And we have to keep on fighting for Ukraine's success. That's the bottom line to this. Ukraine has to prevail, and it will only prevail if we continue to back them, support them, and give them the genuine support, the gear that they need.
I want to leave some time for questions from the audience, but I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up China. You mentioned, of course, the super embassy agreement. I thought that the Chinese pressure campaign on the Starmer government was incredible. Not agreeing final agreement for his trip to Beijing, cutting water supplies intermittently to the UK embassy. So incredible pressure and ultimately was successful on their part. Is that, well, my first question, I guess, is that the end of the story? I know there's some court cases ongoing about the agreement there. And what would a UK conservative policy towards China be? Because it seems to me that,
Sure.
that in the UK and a lot of other capitals, there's a bit of hedging, I think, on China, seeing China as some sort of hedge between the United States. How do you see that?
Well, it's not a hedging. It's not a commodity that we're hedging on, basically, in that sense at all. Look, we're clear. We're clear on China. China is a threat to our country, and it's a threat to our allies. And China has dominated many of the discussions that I've had actually over the last few days as well. First and foremost, and I come back to some of the remarks that I've made today. We have to start demonstrating that we have our own sovereign capabilities. We have been asleep at the wheel when it comes to China for too long. And if we think about the most recent example of technology, 5G technology, Huawei, we were all caught up in this complete cycle where we were told there was no alternative. We have to create alternatives. We have to work together. It's the one thing our two countries can absolutely do together, and I think America and the UK can do this. It is where we lead on innovation, technology, science, all the things where we can flood the marketplace. America is a home of so much innovation. And I think with the British ingenuity that we bring, our strength of support, and all the rest of it as well, we have to start investing in, these areas where China has basically been dominated. So that's the first point that I would make. And that would be a central pillar to the Conservative Party's approach and policy. Alongside that, as I've already said, recognizing China as a threat, we absolutely cannot allow what we see on our own streets, repression. Transnational repression is taking place in the streets of the United Kingdom and in London. We famously have British nationals overseas from Hong Kong in the UK. These people have bounties on their heads. There are illegal Chinese police stations operating in illegal ways. We have to stop all of that, which does mean we have to apply the full force of the law to them, effectively. And they have to know that there will be repercussions. And I think just on my final point on this is very much about a UK-America joint link, is that, we recognize that China we all have a trading relationship with China. We consume goods from China. They come, their ships and products, goods come into our ports and all the rest of it. That's going to continue. There's no doubt about that. However, central to that, though, is effectively how do we ensure that we are keeping our heads above water when it comes to our own goods that we are trading and that we're not compromising ourselves to China. And just on that point of compromising ourselves to China, Keir Starmer did go to China recently. He thought he was going to get a trade arrangement. He did not get a trade arrangement, which basically speaks to the fundamental point that you have to start from a position of strength, not one of weakness. And that's going to be the biggest difference between my party in government and what this Labour government have been doing when it comes to China.
Something that Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan understood, I think, very well. So I think we have time for a few questions from the audience. Sephora, I see your hand first, so I'll go to my colleague. I think we have a mic, Sephora. Hold
Thank you very much, Madam, for your speech. It was extremely important in this current context. I'm Tzipora Fried. I'm a senior fellow visiting from France at the Hudson. So I would like to have your perspective on European rearmament. We finally recognize that there is a strategic necessity and a political priority to rearm, but we can see that there is still a gap between communication and real capacity delivery. What do you think are the major strong points for Europe to rearm, or what are the weaknesses?
So that's a great question, and I will answer both of those points. On the strong points, of course, is effectively, European countries, part of the NATO alliance, have all started, predominantly most of them have started to step up, not all, when it comes to funding. And where there is strength in that alliance, we're seeing great work from, look at Germany. Germany changed their constitution when it came to defence funding. My party spends a lot of time with our colleagues in the CDU, CSU, having these discussions, and I met them recently again, even at the Munich Security Conference. We have our friends such as Poland. Look at the Eastern flank countries, what they're doing. They're already doing the rearmament. They're there on the front line. They are effectively preparing, and they're bringing in the next generation of technology and kit, all the things that they need to defend themselves. So there are some positives there. And the one thing that I would say about what is going on is that there's no point all European countries rearming in the same way. We actually need greater defense cooperation and interoperability. And by that, of course, I'm referring to, a bit like Ukraine with the drones, we can't all be world-class in making drones. We have to have specialisms. And I think that comes on to your second point on the weaknesses, is that lack of coordination and that lack of working out the direction of travel. So, from a British perspective, NATO takes primacy. There's no question about that. And our relationship with America when it comes to growing our strategic alliance on defense and production and capabilities and skills. But I think our European colleagues, in their own way need to be part of that, and they need to learn from some of that as well. They can't do it on their own.
Question from Joel in the back there.
Thank you, ma'am. Joel Rayburn from here at the Hudson Institute. Back in 2017, 2018, I think President Trump and his economic advisors, trade representatives, were somewhat frustrated when, in the wake of Brexit, Prime Minister May and her government did not seem to prioritize trying to get to a strategic economic partnership through free trade agreements, visa-free travel, work authorizations, and so on at that time. And they clearly prioritized trying to almost negotiate their way back into Brussels as opposed to looking for alternatives. If there is a future conservative government, because this is a central element of foreign policy, not just economic policy. So alongside this revivified strategic military alliance that you're talking about, special relationship, is there going to be priority on trying to create a let's say, an Anglosphere almost trade relationship?
So it's a great question, and thank you for raising that. So I'll put my hand up and say I was one of those lobbying the government back then, the British government, to do more with America. So I want to take a little win on that, if I may, and less on Europe, because I did campaign for Brexit. The answer is yes, absolutely. It's not either or. None of this is either or, because we are so deep in terms of our links, our people-to-people ties. People don't talk enough about our people-to-people ties, which are absolutely phenomenal. I have family in the United States. I've had family in the United States for decades. And that is because, of good reasons and positive reasons, the skills that they have to offer your country and all sorts. Trade is fundamental. And of course, in light of the context of why I'm here today and what we've been discussing and, the remarks that I've given, that is all about, depth and strength of the relationship, which covers trade. It covers cooperation, and how we outcompete China, for example. The level of technology and innovation that we need to bring together. Service sector. We have a great, strong, pioneering service sector. Your institutions work with us. Our institutions work with the American organizations too. There is so much more that we can and should be doing. So the current FTA, as it stands, I would argue that's just a starting point. We need to go further with that. We really do. And that's something, as a party that believes in free trade, open trade, the good old-fashioned C word of capitalism and commerce, we want to be at the forefront of that. So that matters to us all, because that's how we grow our economies, make our people more prosperous and give the security that we need to our nations. And of course, that helps to fund deterrence and defense going forward.
Questions? Peter, did you?
Thank you, Dan. Peter Rao. I work with Dan here on Europe issues at Hudson. And I'll just say before I ask my question, based on your performance today, I wouldn't want to have to stand opposite you at the dispatch box in the House of Commons. Let me take you, since you mentioned the MSC a few times, to your meetings in Washington. This is the second time, I think, in your last two visits that you've come by Hudson, and speaking to your staff, you've kept a very full schedule, both last time you were in Washington and during this trip. So what is it that you're hearing in your conversations on Capitol Hill in the administration? What kind of percentage would you assign to these different topics that the Americans are interested in? And just give us a bit of a feel for how they're thinking about the special relationship.
So Peter, thank you. That's a great question. It really is. So, part of my conversations with friends here is very much to give them the reassurance that the special relationship is not a sidebar issue, because that's, in their view, it comes across that way because of the current Labour government. And from me, everybody knows, people that know me well, you get the full fat version from me. There's nothing skinny here going on in terms of that relationship. It is instinctive to us. It's in our DNA. And part of that is the reassurance that I'm giving to them, because conservatism and conservative values prevail very strongly here in the United States, and even more so because of that special relationship. So, Peter, on the issues that we've just been speaking about, absolutely on national security, I held the pen on that, obviously, during my time in government as Home Secretary. I had the privilege of leading Five Eyes and working with my friends here during the Trump administration 1, the first administration, and doing so much together on national security cooperation and all those strong issues. So there is that bond already, and there is that sense of trust, and that really does matter, because they want to know, who can we trust? Who do we go to? Because, of course, when you look at, certainly from what I'm hearing, when they look at the United Kingdom, it's been a bit like this, and a bit of a scattergun as well, and some bits spread thinly. The one thing about us as Conservatives, we are absolutely committed. So for us, it's given that message back very clearly. We've covered everything. I've mentioned national security and defense. Europe, a bit of Europe, but also when it comes to Europe, it's demonstrated that we're not going back in, because the Labour government speaks about their reset with the EU without any of the transparency and accountability like Chagos. They're just sort of like trying to sweep it through and, hide all the details. We'll scrutinise that as well when it comes forward. But fundamentally, that America is the key relationship comes back to the economics, but also shared threats. And much of my conversations, many of the discussions have been based on shared threats and how we should basically be aligning and working together. My party and my views are pretty forthright, clearly. They're unequivocal. With Labour, you don't get that kind of clarity. I mentioned Iran, for example. I feel like sometimes a lone voice, even in Parliament in Iran, even sharing that here amongst friends is important, because, unless they hear it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, they'll just go on what they pick up in the, UK press or bits online, etc. So, in those last famous words, I'll certainly be back, and I'll be continuing the dialogue and discussion and giving our friends in this administration every reassurance that conservatism from my party's side is more than alive and kicking. It's absolutely strong, and we're making the case, and we want to continue to work with our friends here on all these key areas.
I think that's a good note to end on. So would you please all join me in giving a round of applause to the Shadow Foreign Secretary?
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Dan.